With us are our guest Anthea Jeffery, Head of Policy Research at the South African Institute of Race Relations, and Nic Borain, Political Analyst, who joins us from Cape Town. Anthea, let's start off by actually going into the depth of some of these internal contradictions, and in particular looking at the pieces of policy that you think do not speak to each other within the National Development Plan. Speak to us a little bit about those.
Right. Let me talk about some of the bills that have been pushed through Parliament recently which contradict the NDP's goals of growth and jobs. One, for example, is the mining bill, and one of the things it introduces is compulsory beneficiation of mineral products wherever the minister designates a particular mineral. Now, the National Development Plan warned against beneficiation as a vehicle of growth for South Africa. It said we don't have enough energy for the primary stages of beneficiation, such as smelting or refining, and we don't have sufficient skills for the final stages of beneficiation, the making of finished products. And we also would find it very difficult to compete with other countries. Just to take one example, in the context of cutting and polishing diamonds, our costs are about 5 times those of India's. So therefore, we have no competitive advantage in this sphere. And despite all the evidence against making beneficiation compulsory, that's what the mining bill seeks to do. And it also gives the Minerals Minister great powers to say that certain minerals will be identified either as designated for beneficiation or strategic. If they're strategic minerals, they may be subjected to both price and export controls. And take the context of coal. Eskom is going to need a great deal more coal from about 2018 onwards. But coal mining companies are beginning to say we're wary to invest in the new mines that are necessary when we're not sure what export controls might be applied, what pricing controls might be applied. If we can't determine what the price is going to be, if we can't rely on our projections of international prices, for example, but it all depends on what the minister says, then we're shooting in the dark when we make our projections, as Mark Kutafani put it. So therefore, it's very off-putting. And mining companies will tend to think, well, we won't invest at all. We might continue with our existing mines because we have already there a commitment and money in the ground. But when it comes to putting in new investment, we're wary because the minister now has so many powers that could make it very difficult to run a profitable and successful mining venture.
Anthea, I'd like us to keep on that mining note. And Nic, to come to you, something so poignant that Nozipho mentioned as we were off air was with regard to the ongoing platinum sector mining strikes, which are currently in the 15th week. Quite clearly, this perhaps does seem to be something that is a test for the issues that the NDP actually seeks to address. A test perhaps that we failed, perhaps, from your perspective?
You know, I think, again, this is more implicit than explicit in the NDP. And personally, I think it's implicit, if not explicit, in the rise of Jacob Zuma within the ANC and his victory, if you like, at Mangaung. His acceptance of his pushing, and then the acceptance of the ANC, of the NDP. There's various people speaking in my earphone, by the way, so sorry about this. I might be quite distracted.
Go ahead, Nic.
Are you still there?
We're listening.
Yes,
loud and clear. Okay, it does seem as though we're experiencing some technical issues there, Nozipho, in speaking to Nic, but we will sort out that connectivity in a moment. But again, coming to that issue that you mentioned, perhaps a litmus test that we're failing from South Africa's perspective.
I mean, I really think it's about an alignment of business, government and labour. And if this is a litmus test, as you've said, Gugu, that this seems to be a test that at this current moment we seem to be failing. Your views on that, Anthea?
I think you put your finger on it when you say that the National Development Plan does seek that kind of cooperation and a kind of consensus about the way in which we should go forward. But that goal is certainly not being reflected in what's happening in the mining strike. I think we also need to look a little bit wider too, to look at what are the issues which affect our labour environment. And if we look, for example, at the World Economic Forum's survey of global competitiveness and how we fare on that, then we see that for a number of years we've been pretty much close to last in the world for cooperation between employer and employees, and also pretty much last in the world on wages and productivity, which are important issues for investors too. So we have, in that particular strike, I think a tragedy of great moment for all those involved. Miners who've gone without pay, companies that may not be able to sustain platinum mining operations in the Rustenburg area. But we also have a deeper set of issues which those indicators on the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Survey point to. What can we do in general to improve cooperation, to reduce strikes, and to make sure that there's a stronger link between pay and productivity?
And I want to go back to the point that you raised about beneficiation. I mean, the state's argument that we always hear about beneficiation is that if we don't do it and we don't impose these pieces of legislation on these mining companies and other companies that are mining our raw minerals, we will remain in a vicious cycle where we're exporting minerals and then we're buying them back at an added price. And so at some point, it seems that you, even if it's not yet competitive, that you begin imposing the building of refineries and you begin building the skill set that allows you to become increasingly competitive. How do you then respond to that developmental argument that is consistently brought up in relation to beneficiation?
I can understand very well that the government sees it's important that we should add value to minerals in the country before we export them. I think it's also vital to be realistic about what's possible to be achieved. We must have more electricity to begin with. We must have better skills also. We must have a greater level of investment flowing into the country to fund everything that is necessary. And we must recognize where we have competitive advantage and where we don't. And where we don't, we can't simply decree it. The government may wish it, but it's something which has to be built up slowly. And again, it goes back to that link between pay and productivity. We're thoroughly undercut by China. China's wages are just far below ours. They may be rising now as growth accelerates in that economy, but at the moment they are far lower than ours, and we can't easily compete. And the same with India, as I gave the example there. So we must be evidence-based to pick up on what Nic Borain said and do what is sensible. And the IDC has also been struggling for a number of years to promote beneficiation, similar mandate from the government, but finding it extremely difficult to do.
But moving on to the theme of today, keeping in line with the South African elections taking place today. Now, the South Africa's National Development Plan seeks to broaden socio-economic transformation in the country by the year 2030. Joining us now for more insight is Anthea Jeffery, Head of Policy Research at the South African Institute of Race Relations. And in our Cape Town studios, we're joined by political analyst Nic Borain. Lady and gent, thank you so much for joining us today. Anthea, perhaps if we start off this conversation with you. You no doubt believe that the NDP is a great plan, but unfortunately there are some other legal policies in place which appear to contradict this. Elaborate further.
Yes, I think I'd like to begin by saying I'm not sure that it's a great plan because it's full of internal contradictions and it has no costings, so it seems like something of a wish list. But beyond its internal weaknesses, there is indeed the great problem that the government has been putting onto the statute book a whole number of policies which comprehensively contradict its goals of bringing our growth rate up from 1.9% or so, where it stands now, to 5.4% of GDP every year, and making sure that we generate 11 million new jobs by 2030, so reducing our unemployment rate down to 6%. These are very important goals, but we won't attain them if we keep contradicting them through the policy interventions that we make.
Well, there seems to be contradictions in policy intervention that Anthea is going to be unpacking for us. But Nic, let me come to you in Cape Town. From where you sit, do you think that the National Development Plan is the answer that's going to leapfrog South Africa from a development and an economic point of view for the incoming administration?
Hi, Guguletu. The National Development Plan, by the way, my voice is playing back to myself very loudly in my ear, which is difficult to concentrate. Anyway, the National Development Plan was a great idea in how it was conceived. It was a plan all the way to 2030 to stimulate economic growth. Initially, it was going to follow the Indian model, where a whole lot of cabinet ministers would be sitting in a committee and making long-term plans and integrating all of our policies so that they would meet the general objectives, which was essentially to bring everyone out of poverty, defined very specifically, and to reduce inequality in the country. I think quite with a lot of foresight, Jacob Zuma instructed Trevor Manuel to set it up as a broader, non-governmental thing, got experts from everywhere, and looked at all aspects of the economy, tried to argue that this is an evidence-based approach to planning, that we could work out everything we needed to do by looking in detail at the evidence. They came up with a plan, and I suppose that is published as a massive document and is sitting out there. It's been adopted at Mangaung in the ANC, it's been adopted by government, and I think there's a lot of talk that the Jacob Zuma final administration is going to capacitate this plan. It's going to build a department around it and put a lot of emphasis into it. That being said, that's all very well. I agree very strongly with Anthea that it's nothing more than a shopping list. It's a whole lot of series of things that we really need to do, but if you try and think about this as an actual plan with detailed things that we need to do, the question of costing, the question of the institutions that are going to do it, the question of capacity, the question of the unresolved ideological tensions in the plan. I'm not one of those that would say, well, the National Development Plan, it's business friendly, let's go, it's going to be great. I think, well, maybe we'll get onto it in a little later. At this stage, it's more like a shopping list than anything else.
The shopping list that you mentioned there, Nic, Anthea, perhaps if you can elaborate on it further, what's missing here? The cart, the budget to be able to roll out the procedure here, and does it need to be reviewed maybe?
Well, I think it needs to be, first of all, more internally consistent. At the one point, for example, the National Development Plan speaks of the need for a capable developmental state. And indeed, the Southeast Asian tigers, which are the model of the developmental state, all had a very professional, expert bureaucracy to help administer. Now, we don't have that in South Africa for a whole number of reasons, stemming from our apartheid past, plus our failure to improve education since 1994. So we don't have the people within the public service who can really meet those ideals. And we can't have a capable developmental state unless we solve that problem. But the NDP seems to have very few ideas about what we can do to solve that problem. In terms of the money, it has some very ambitious ideas, that we should have guaranteed minimum living standards for all, that we must have a vast expansion in tertiary education, that we must also have a national insurance scheme that will make healthcare available free at the point of service to all South Africans. These are all ambitions which I think would be widely endorsed within the country, but you have to be able to pay for them because they are also going to be very expensive. And the NDP is silent on how we're going to achieve that. And the fact is that the government is under financial pressure already. We have increasing public debt, the budget deficit is going up, interest that has to be paid every year is one of the most rapidly growing items on the budget every year. And also we have a trade deficit. So we have to do things that will keep money flowing into the country, the savings of foreigners, in order to help us grow our economy. And we therefore can't afford to make the sorts of policy interventions that I've flagged as contradictory to the NDP and worrying for our prospects of boosting growth, attracting investment, generating more jobs.
Nic, this is Nozipho here with Gugu in Johannesburg. Let's look at the outcome of this particular election and the implications that it has for the implementation of the NDP. Does a weaker ANC threaten the possibility of the incoming administration to successfully implement this plan?
Hi, Nozipho. I think not. I think that there's none of the polling predictions, Ipsos being the most obvious one, are projecting an ANC that's going to get much less than 63% of the vote. I think that informally, a lot of people believe that Jacob Zuma is going to vigorously implement the NDP. Given the kind of the things that Anthea had been saying and that I said too, I'm not sure exactly what that means. But I know that, for example, the IMF, business, have endorsed the policy for a general set of reasons. Remember, we've had similar sets of policies. We had the Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative for South Africa. Before that, we had GEAR, the Growth and Employment, the Redistribution and Employment Macroeconomic Policy. Since then, we've had versions of industrial and other policy, like the Industrial Policy Action Plan 1, 2, and 3, and that we've had from Minister Patel's department, a new growth path. All of these, in some way or another, are plans to do a number of things, possibly most importantly to remove the bottlenecks that are preventing economic growth, from certain infrastructural requirements, from broadband to the efficiency of ports and rails, to education, and a whole range of other things. The content that the NDP eventually has, the content that it's eventually that is given to the policy, I think, is still to be decided. It is still a matter of considerable debate and ideological contestation within the ANC. I think Trevor Manuel, and within the ruling alliance more particularly, I think Trevor Manuel was deeply frustrated, it always sounded like it to me, about the fact that certain elements within the alliance, what he meant was COSATU and some as groups within the SACP, who were arguing in a non-evidence-based approach. He was arguing the NDP, we put the evidence on the table and we argued this is how we are to proceed, knowing that evidence. I think we're going to see a lot of emphasis on the NDP. I think that business, the global capital markets, the ratings agencies are going to say, good, that's a great thing. But I think it's really more than raising a flag at this stage. I think Anthea, in a way, has taken the NDP more seriously than I have and looked at the actual policy contradictions. I don't think that the NDP is anything more than a very general statement of intent and a very detailed shopping list of nice things to have. The contradictions could get ironed out, or they could get worse depending on how we go. But I think in general, investors, business would smile upon Jacob Zuma vigorously implementing the NDP and possibly setting up a department to actually run it within government.
Where it has been exclusively for Indians in the past, when you look at the line now, are you seeing a transformation in just who is standing to queue in Lenasia now?
Yes, to some degree. There are a lot of black voters in Lenasia. I've only come across one white voter, though. So there's still some transformation to take place on that front.
Nadira Pia, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Lenasia. And we will keep in mind that Lenasia is of political significance in the South African landscape. It was one of the first communities that was opposed to the national tricameral election, this in 1984 as well as in 1989. And it also saw the birth of the UDF, one of the parties that was very strong in its support of the anti-apartheid struggle. Well, that's what we got from Lenasia. Moving back to studio now, we still have Anthea Jeffery, Head of Policy Research at the South African Institute of Race Relations, tripping over my R's there, and Nic Borain, Political Analyst, who joins us from Cape Town. Nic, let's come to you in Cape Town. We did lose you for a moment, then hope that we can bring you back on this particular question that you were addressing earlier. We're talking about the platinum strike marching into its 15th week now, as a litmus test or an indicator of the failure of the NDP to bring some sort of alignment between business, government and labor. If we were to look at the strike, would you say that this is an indicator that we can use of the weakness of the NDP?
I think what I was busy saying is I wouldn't put it as a failure of the NDP. I would like to point out that the NDP as a policy, when it was adopted at Mangaung, when it was adopted by Cabinet, as it was being formulated, was opposed quite vociferously at different points by COSATU, and less vociferously and on fewer points by the South African Communist Party. And it's been my impression that Jacob Zuma's ANC is much more prepared than any ANC previously to tread on the toes of organised labour, COSATU. Obviously, AMCU is a slightly different and more complex issue because AMCU has taken a position quite specifically opposed to the ANC politically. I have, when the platinum, the big three platinum companies took the hard line that they have taken against AMCU, I have worked on the working assumption, I have no proof, that there's an implicit backing from the Jacob Zuma government for the stance that they've taken. And this to me goes together with a general move in the ANC, in Jacob Zuma's ANC, of preparedness to go against the will of its left-wing allies, the NDP being the most obvious example. I think that this ANC is going to say, listen, we need this. The last card we have got to play is economic growth. By 2019, we're going to be really up against it if we're not growing this economy. And we, as far as we're concerned, the best way to grow this economy is via the NDP. So I suspect, without suggesting that it's a failure of the NDP, that this ANC, and one of the reasons why the trade unions are not delighted with the NDP, is that it implicitly insists that Labour comes to the party. And I think that in the next while we're going to see, certainly after the elections, a harder line and a more overt, what form that will take, who knows, and more overt backing of government, of management in the strike, and criticism and effort to resolve the strike as quickly as possible. It's hugely damaging to the South African economy, as we know.
Nic, it's interesting that you say perhaps that Labour needs to come to the party, but Anthea, I'd like to put it to you that perhaps the government itself is not coming to the party and making South Africa a business-friendly environment. We have the free stake carry that they could potentially increase with regard to new oil and gas explorations, as well as international security companies potentially having to sell off 51% ownership of their companies to local South Africans. So are we lacking in driving this economic growth, as you say, with regard to the NDP?
Indeed we are. You pick out two important examples and there are many more. The government is also pushing through a number of laws that will really fundamentally undermine property rights in other spheres as well. And the immediate focus is on commercial agricultural land, but the laws that are being passed have a wider definition of property and could go beyond that. But concentrating for the moment on land, we have the reopening of the land claims process, which is likely to be highly damaging to commercial agriculture, a very important source of jobs for unskilled people. And we have, perhaps most worryingly of all, the misleadingly named Promotion and Protection of Investment Bill, which will make it possible for the government to take property without paying compensation at all. If it takes it as custodian for the disadvantaged, and then allows black people, those who've made land claims, for example, to apply to it for leases to use a certain amount of that land for a period. This is actually also very much the policy of the economic freedom fighters. On that, the ANC and the EFF seem to be agreed. And it is something which has very damaging ramifications, because if you erode property rights in the context of agriculture, investors as a whole will be alarmed, particularly when they can see erosions of property rights in many other spheres, in mining, in the oil sector, in the security industry, and so on. And just to highlight the importance of growth at this point, the government often likes to talk about the fact that we brought the average rate of economic growth since 1994 up to around 3.3%. But if you look at growth on a per capita basis, it was 1.1% in 1994, and it's 0.6% at the end of 1993.
Practically half.
So it's diminished. And on a per capita basis, that's what really counts the most. And of course, we know from all around the world that the countries that are the most wealthy on a per capita basis are those which allow the most economic freedom as properly conceived, in other words, freedom from state control and ownership, and allow their economies to flourish, allow entrepreneurship and enterprise to take off.